On this program, we study, explore, and discover the path to happiness. You'll recall from the very first talk that I admitted that there are so many things that people do all around the world to be happy. And there are so many paths that have been laid out and promoted, and people are encouraged to take in the name of happiness. People do a multitude of things. Different things make different people happy. As the saying goes, horses for causes. But despite the numerous ways in which people claim to be able to achieve happiness, it is ironical, though, isn't it, that people are as yet not fully satisfied. Ask yourself this very question. Are you happy? Are you truly happy? Are there things that worry you in the back of your mind? Whenever you wear a smile on your face, does that cover a frown or a cry that was on your face a few minutes, a few hours, a few days ago? Is that simply a mask? Do you check yourself in the mirror before you receive visitors to your home to make sure you look presentable? And that's not just the makeup, but to make sure that it is not evident from your face that you have been unhappy, frustrated, angry, disappointed a few minutes ago, and then you try and wear your best smile to show that you are happy to others? Are you not fed up of pretending to be happy? Is it not time that we discovered, for all of man's advances in technology and various other fields, is it not time that we find the true path to happiness? Think about it. The purpose of these talks, ladies and gentlemen, is one, to awaken you to the truth. Two, to ask you to question yourself. Are you living a life to which you are honest yourself? Or are you putting up a pretense? Sometimes keeping up with the Joneses, as they say. To be fully satisfied and to live a fulfilling life, one should discover the path to unconditional happiness. What do we mean by that? A happiness that does not depend on one or more external factors. And by now, for those of you who have been listening to these talks regularly, I'm sure you will appreciate that happiness is twofold. I agree, we haven't as yet discussed in its full detail what unconditional happiness entails, but we have discussed the problem with conditional happiness. This is the only happiness we have known thus far. What is conditional happiness? Happiness that is dependent on various conditions being in our favor. Think about the things that make you happy, and think about how that happiness can be taken away from you. Just think about today. How many things happened just in the course of the day that made you happy, and how many things happened that made you unhappy? So you see, it is obvious then, isn't it, that there are external factors that can influence your state of mind, your happiness, your unhappiness. The purpose of these talks is to break you free from that dependency. It is possible. It is entirely possible. And that is why I have chosen this path for myself. I have personally gone as far as I possibly could, and also much further than the average person in the pursuit of happiness, in the ways that most people around the world seek happiness, whether it is through wealth, power, relationships, social status, and so on. In my personal life, in my lay life before I became a monk, I explored all of these options and avenues as far as I possibly could. And when I encountered the teaching of the Buddha, I realized that actually there is a greater happiness that I could achieve by following that path that I could never achieve by following the path that I was on back then. And this is the reason that I chose to consider this alternative. I agree and I expect that you today, and perhaps our listeners in the future, will not be Buddhists either by choice or by birthright. Because Buddhist philosophy is not essentially for Buddhists. Buddhist philosophy is to realize, and it does not matter what religion, race, creed, or belief system you hold on to. My ask of you is that you continue to be faithful to your religion, whichever that might be, to your belief, whichever that might be, to your place of worship, whether that is a mosque, a church, a temple. My ask of you is that you continue to be a patron, to be a benefactor to these places, to these institutions. The only thing I ask of you, those of you who join these talks, is to be open-minded and consider what I share with you. Everything I present to you on these talks will appeal to the intellect. I will not share with you things that you must take through blind faith. I will not ask you to believe anything just because I say so, or that I read this in a book and therefore it must be true, or so and so said so, and therefore you must believe it. I myself am not one like that. I always question. I always analyze. I reflect. And I apply. I take what I learn into the lab of life. And then I test for myself. I listen with faith, but that's not to say I accept it all as true. No matter what I listen to, I listen with faith. Because if I do not have faith, then there is no point in me listening to it. The faith that I have is not that it has to be true. The faith that I have is that whoever is sharing whatever they know with me may have my interests at hand, at least to a small extent. They just may have something that I find of interest, and they just might be sharing something which they believe will help me. Not all people in this world are bad. There are good people around. In fact, most people are good people. So that is why I listen to whatever I listen to with faith. But faith alone is not what I use to accept something and then hold it as true, as a doctrine, as a philosophy for my life. What I then do is whatever I have listened to with faith, I then verify. I verify in the lab of life. What is this lab of life? It is simply my personal life. In the experiences that I go through, in the people I meet, the places I go to, the things that happen in my life. These are the experiences, these are the things that happen in my life. This is simply my life. So I apply what I learn in the lab of life, and it is then I realize which of the things I have learned I can accept as true, and then I keep them with me and adopt that as my philosophy for life. Then there may be other things which, when I test in the lab of life, doesn't stand true. It doesn't hold water. What I then do is not completely and categorically discard it, but I put it to a side. I put it to a side because it may be that some point in the future, perhaps when I have more information, more experience, I may wish to revisit that learning. I may wish to reconsider, and then it may turn out to be something that is more acceptable to me than it once was. So this is the method that I ask of each and every one of our listeners. I am not seeking followers because I'm not one. I can't expect of you something that I am not. What I'm looking for are good students. Students of not myself, but rather students of life. People who are interested, people who are keen on learning about themselves. A lot of people are very interested in learning about what goes on around them, what happens on the other side of the globe, what happens on Moon and what happens on Mars. But very few people indeed are interested in what happens to them. So, this is all I expect from you, to be a good student of yourself, of life itself. So today, as we take another step forward on our journey, and hopefully move forward and proceed on the path to seeking this unconditional happiness, let us begin today's program by making our veneration to the Supremely Enlightened Lord Buddha. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Last week, what did we talk about? Oh yes, we talked about the roller coaster of life. Figuratively, metaphorically, we discussed how a roller coaster is something of an experience, and how the experience of a roller coaster, for those who may have ridden one, would have experienced pleasure. We discussed how pleasure is not quite what we have always thought it to be. So far, we have introduced this term called vexation, if you remember, and for the time being, I think we can simply think of it as a void that we feel deep down inside our minds. It is the sensation that something is missing, an unsatisfactoriness, that we are not fulfilled, that something needs to happen to make us happy. It's a negative feeling because none of us enjoy being vexed, and the numerous examples we talked about last week should give you some indication of that. We will continue to discuss a few more examples this week as well. And this is because I really want you to try and understand this concept of vexation. Because through vexation, you will begin to properly understand what pleasure is. So we have always experienced pleasure throughout our lives, but never really stopped to ask ourselves the question, to ponder what pleasure really was. So this is conditional happiness. Pleasure is conditional happiness. Let's take another example. Have you heard the saying, and I'm sure you have, absence makes the heart grow fonder? It's a very common one, isn't it? Absence makes the heart grow fonder. And an example of this, something that happened to me once a few years back, has vividly stuck in my mind, and I'd like to share that with you. A moment when this absence makes the heart grow fonder truly came to life for me. So here's how it went. One fine day, I wanted to set out and go out and get some work done. I was at home and I was going to drive my car to get there. So what I did was I walked to where I normally leave my car keys, and when I got there, I realized the keys were missing. So it just wasn't there. So at home, we had this place on a key holder where I used to put my keys, but my car key wasn't there. So I did what any person would do, is look for their keys. And some of the places you'd look for would normally be your pockets. So that would be your first port of call. Then I couldn't find it there either. So I walked into the bedroom and I looked for it where I would normally expect to find it. So on the dressing table, besides the bed. I also looked in the cupboards just in case I might have put it there by mistake, and I couldn't find it in any of these places. Now by this point I was starting to get a little bit worried, but I had only checked the bedroom, so I didn't begin to fret. I reassured myself that soon enough I should be able to find them. Then I walked into the living room and I also saw my wife there, and I asked her, "Have you seen my keys, honey?" And she, as she normally does, suggested some of the obvious places. And I said, "Yes, I've checked in all those places, but I haven't found it. Would you mind giving me a hand?" So she also joined this key patrol to try and find my car keys. And so we looked around the dining table. Oh, I also checked in the fridge, just in case. Everywhere in the kitchen, in the cupboards, in the pantry. Now you can imagine by this point, I was getting a little bit worried. I could feel myself getting anxious, and because one of the problems was that there was only one key. I had previously lost the other key, and against better advice, I decided not to get another key cut, for which I cursed myself at that point, but it was too late for that. So then I went into the other rooms in the house and started to look for the keys, and I couldn't find them. So I was really worried by that time. I then walked into the garden, just in case. Who knows? Sometimes you find things in the most unexpected of places. Under the kitchen sink, between the cushions in the sofa, under the TV stand, behind the TV, in the post box, would you believe it? In the laundry, in the washing machine, behind the fridge, you name it. I even checked in the bathroom, and I couldn't find it. At that point, I was a complete wreck. I really needed to make this journey, but more than that, I was really worried by now because without my key, I wouldn't be able to drive my car again. Yes, I know you could get a replacement, but that was going to be very expensive. To somehow contact a keysmith and to get them to turn up and somehow work their magic and get a key cut. And also, these keys were some of those advanced keys that they have these days, and it wasn't easy to get a duplicate cut. You actually had to contact the manufacturer. So it would take me some time to get hold of a replacement. And I didn't have all that time either, because there were some errands I needed to run and they were pressing. So I was pulling my hair out. And no, that's not how I lost all my hair, as that happened later. But what little hair I had back then, I was pulling on it, and I was I was almost having a nervous breakdown at that point. So at this point, I was very frustrated, and I could feel my heart pounding because I had lost something that was very important and precious to me. I really loved my car, I must say. It was a Volvo, the newer model S40 back then. I really loved it because it was the first car that I bought, and she was my pet back then. So I used to call her Black Beauty because she was black. And so I couldn't find my keys. I walked to the car as if to apologize, because at this point I was very disappointed with myself. I walked to the car as if to apologize and to confess how irresponsible I had been with her. And I was sweating because of how nervous I was feeling at that point. And I just my legs couldn't carry the rest of my body by that point. I was so disappointed. I was, as I said, almost having a nervous breakdown. So I sat down beside the car against the wheel, and I held my head in my hands in frustration, and I was now trying to think what I could do to come out of this problem. At that point, a thought came to my mind. I don't know where it came from, but it just came into my mind, and I thought, perhaps I should just check under the car. And I did. And lo and behold, the key was there behind one of the wheels. So it was covered from clear sight. That is why I hadn't seen it before. Now, when I saw my key and I put my arm out and grabbed it and held it in my hands, you have no idea how happy I was. I thought at that point that there couldn't be a happier man alive. All I had in my hands was a pair of keys, and I was sat there on the ground against Black Beauty, thinking to myself that I was the happiest man alive, just holding a pair of keys in my hand, and I was elated. I couldn't explain how happy I was at that point. I was almost jumping up and down in happiness and in delight. I ran back into the house, to the kitchen, and gave my wife a hug and said, "Darling, I love you so much." I don't know why I said that. Had nothing to do with me having found the keys, but it was my way of expressing a deep sense of relief, a deep sense of satisfaction, a deep sense of joy and happiness, and what's the word? Pleasure. Now, if you're anything like me, I'm sure most of you will have had similar experiences in their lives. I can't be the only one who's done something so silly as that. I think people lose things all the time, and then they start to vex, and then when they find it, they feel a great sense of pleasure. See, again, we find here the logic behind this pleasure. How pleasure works. It is to demonstrate this principle that I brought this example to life. How did that work? You see, this pair of keys, I'd had it with me for as long as I'd had my car, and I would see it day in, day out. I would have held those keys in my hand so many times previous to that, many countless times, maybe hundreds if not thousands of times. But on no occasion prior to that had I sensed so much joy having seen or held that pair of keys. How could a pair of keys bring me so much joy? I began to ask myself. This very pair of keys I had seen many times over, far too many times to count or remember. This very pair of keys that I'd held in my hand, swirled around, but I'd never experienced so much pleasure as I did that day when I found my lost pair of keys. So, how did I experience that sensation of pleasure? Would you even suggest that said pleasure was given to me by the keys? Are you suggesting that the pair of keys is a source of pleasure? Could that be true? Should I not have experienced that pleasure every time I held that pair of keys in my hand? But I didn't. It was only that day, perhaps the only time I experienced more pleasure would have been the day I first got my car and those keys were handed over to me. So that was when I took possession of the car. But this day, a few years later, I experienced an euphoria of delight that I had not experienced before. Certainly not in regards to a pair of keys. It's not possible then, is it, for us to explain this pleasure through any connection to the key itself? What did the key have to do with my pleasure? The pleasure that I experienced at that point. I was completely overjoyed. I was so delighted. And in fact, I think relieved was the best word I could use in that situation. So what had happened? Absence had made the heart grow fonder. Had it? See, I agree with that saying, absence makes the heart grow fonder. But I think it would be prudent of us to take a closer look at how that is the case. In a previous week we discussed beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. And while we accepted that, we took a closer look. We analyzed it by taking a closer look at it and asked ourselves, how is it that beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder?